Hello and welcome again, everyone, to the session today. Welcome to Silicon Beach and welcome to How Not to Waste Money Building Software with Patrick Brown from Query Law. A little bit about Patrick Brown. Pat used to be a lawyer and is running his own law firm, but he's also got a little bit bored by law somewhere in between on the way, and then he decided to take a break and learn coding. And he used his new learned superpower to actually create a tool that is helping him to provide amazing service and amazing value to his clients by reducing the cost and the time that they've spent in creating legal documents together with him by a factor of 10. So we got to know Patrick about 1 month, 6 weeks ago when he pitched at the Silicon Beach Pitch Night. And since then, we're basically in weekly contact. He participated in a on-stage pitch night here in Melbourne 4 weeks ago. And yeah, we did an interview with him. He's an amazing guy. He has a lot of knowledge to share. He knows both sides of the story. And I'm looking very much forward to this session today. Patrick, over to you.
Thanks, David. Super nice things to say. Appreciate it. I'll try and live up to it. So everybody, as David said, I still run a law firm and I develop software for that law firm, basically. And so I am providing these tips from the perspective of someone who actually codes and recognizes how difficult that is and how time consuming it can be. And you know, how easy it is for misunderstandings to arise around a complicated thing, which is the building of software. But also, I suppose, in my other life, I remain a lawyer. And at my law firm, Query Law, we're negotiating software development agreements. And so I suppose I have also got that side of it in the sense that I do see people making the same mistakes over and over again, which do sometimes result in legal disputes. And so my purpose here today is to just provide basic information, particularly to non-technical founders who are working with software developers to get incentives aligned and to try and avoid disputes because disputes are terrible when they're legal, they're expensive and time consuming and stressful. So you want to do everything you can to avoid them. Now, I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone that I'm advising who is working with a software developer. So let's just say for the purposes of this presentation, I'm on the customer side of the transaction. I will be talking a little bit about how to control your developer and how to remove risk from the relationship with the developer. And that's not because I don't like developers. I love developers. They are my favorite people to work with. I love working with engineers. But I do want, from the client side today, to try and give you as much information to avoid trouble as possible. So, and if there's anyone here who's a developer, I'm actually really interested to hear what you have to say about it. And I'm sorry if it's all very basic. I'm sure that this is stuff that all of you already know. And for the non-technical founders, please let me know if I am too complicated in my explanations, because I'd like to make sure that you're, grokking or understanding what it is that I'm talking about. So I think the first thing to say is that people have an idea for an app. At this point, it's practically a cliche. Lots of people do, and that's a good thing. There are many ideas in people's heads that can really move us forward as a species. But the problem with having an idea only in your head is that it is rarely correct and it always changes when you actually bring it into the world and you manifest it somewhat. And so sometimes I've noticed that people have an idea in their head, and when you poke at the edges of it, they can't give you answers about stuff that's basic. Now, that's natural, especially for someone who hasn't built software before. But the way to avoid the problems that arise from having the thing in your head be incomplete is to create a manifestation in the real world of that thing as quickly as you possibly can. So first thing you would do is wireframe. A wireframe is just a simple representation of what you imagine the application will look like. Now, if you can afford it, it also makes sense to use a designer to help you spec out or put more detail into the wireframe. I think this is pretty important because a designer is a professional. They know what's conventional and what's not. And ultimately, you want your app to be something that people can easily understand. And so the more you follow convention, the more easily people will use what you're building, which is, of course, why you're building it. So if I just move on to my next section here, you can get people to operate in a very cost-effective way on Upwork. Just make sure that you restrict your search to candidates who are at like a 95% and above reputation, who speak good English, and who have some nice looking stuff in their portfolio. So you can get solid designers at pretty affordable rates if you have a good look around Upwork and other sites. Just be very selective about who it is that you work with. Now, the other thing, and I fear insulting the developers who are with us today, but often, and I include myself in this category, developers are not great at user experience. And so I think there's a commercial imperative sometimes for a developer who's selling a service to get somebody in the door and to start to code. And actually, people will come to a developer, they'll tell them the idea, and the developer will sign a contract with them and they'll all get started. And the fact is that it's much cheaper to design stuff than it is to code stuff, to make it appear in front of you. And if you use a designer rather than a coder to really get some of the detail in your idea, that's going to help you a lot. Now, I mean, I've talked here a lot about sort of manifesting a thing in the real world as quickly as you can. And really, the reason why that's worthwhile is that the better you understand the thing, the better that the coder who you're going to work with understands the thing, the less likely you are to have misunderstandings that then result in a dispute. That's basically the purpose of this process. So I'm sure many of you are nodding your heads and saying, that's something I've already done. Why is he telling us this stuff? And it's because, frankly, a lot of people don't do it. So that's the first thing. I'm just having nothing in the chat yet. So, okay. Now, if I move on to...
May I quickly hop in here with a question, Pat?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So could it be another benefit to split it up, the developer and the designer, so you actually progress in smaller steps instead of committing to a large contract, a large chunk of money straight away?
Yes. In an ideal world, you would like to have fairly detailed designs before actually the developer starts to code. So absolutely, if you can break it up into steps like that, that's a really good thing. And it's a natural thing, I think, for people to say, well, I want to build software, I should go and speak to a software developer. And that's the first thing they do before they speak actually to a designer. And that's, I think, what causes this problem. The developer wants to sell the service, sign the document, get started. And, you know, there's not necessarily bad faith there on the developer's part, but it's really good to go to a developer as prepared as you can be with what it is that you're building. And I'm sure actually a lot of the developers here would be very happy to hear that. The less they need to help you specify what it is that you're building, the better for them. So now I'm going to move on to a discussion of tech considerations. So, and this is again something that I'll just say it up front, because this is what I say to my clients. You want to make your software developer as replaceable as possible. That's not because you don't love them. It's just that if you have a single point of failure, if your developer gets hit by a bus or there's a dispute with the developer, and that's not unusual, you do want the ability to replace them without your business stopping. So what I'd say is that if you're working in a startup, sometimes people say, well, look, coding is not for me. That's not my jam. That's what the developer's for. It's over to them. And what I'd say is yeah, you can do that. But actually, as a startup person, you really are going to do better if you're a generalist. You need to know a little bit about a lot. It's a very helpful characteristic. And so you should try and learn what you can at a high level about what people are building for you and how they're building it. So I'd say it's worthwhile keeping in mind that the quality of software developers, it's highly variable. There are some brilliant people, of course, but sometimes people want cheap, they go offshore, and when they do that, they end up with people who aren't building them good stuff. And it's a really important point to make that a developer who's not so talented, who is doing bad code, can make a thing work on the screen in front of you. But that doesn't mean actually that they've built a thing that you can then work with in the future. And so just a developer can just patch bad code together. It looks like it works. You're like, well, great, it does what I want it to do. But then later on, you're trying to make changes to it, and it's an absolute nightmare. So just keep in mind that that's a thing that you need to guard against. So the platinum, sorry, David, go ahead.
And I had it even just with relatively simple things like web development, a website that people, providers, web developers told me, I'm happy to redo your website for you, but I start from scratch because I'm not working with the code that someone else created.
Yeah, that happens a lot. Absolutely. That's exactly the phenomenon I'm talking about. You want people who build good code so that actually future developers are willing to work on it, so you don't have to rebuild. So it's nice of you to say that, David. That's a thing that happens often. The platinum
as a non-technical person, how do I make sure that my code is clean?
Yeah, so next point that I was going to make here, the platinum approach is to get a different developer who understands the same language and framework as your developer to actually just take a quick look at the code and tell you what the quality is. Right? Cross-referencing the opinions of people, get a second opinion. People say it about doctors all the time. I like to say it about coders too. Now it's a bit of extra hassle, it's a little bit of extra money, although it should only be a few hours of work. But it really does cut down the risk. And also, frankly, if the developer knows that someone is going to come and scrutinize their code, they're more likely to do a good job. And you want to do that early. Don't wait until the end of the project to have an independent review by another developer skilled in the language. Do it as early as you can, so that you can basically stop the relationship if it turns out that your code is not so great.
We have we have a comment from Nikki here. She is mentioning that the solution architect is important too.
Certainly, that's an approach to take. Absolutely. I mean, some people want to cut down on headcount, but look, if you can afford it, that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely.
What about outsourcing CTOs? I've come across those people more and more these days that are just working part-time for different startups and different small businesses, helping getting their requirements for software and tech development right.
To the extent that they're doing code, all of this stuff exactly applies to that as well. So basically, if someone's working for you in a technical capacity, you want to make sure that what they're doing for you makes sense, even if you don't understand it yourself. That's kind of the golden rule here. And you also honestly want the ability to replace that person if there's a problem. So that's why one of the golden rules here is make your software developer replaceable, even if you love them. And that's the lawyer in me talking, not the software developer. I think another thing to keep in mind is the difference between language and framework. Sometimes people don't understand the difference between a code language and the framework built on top of that code language. So the language is like literally what people type into the code editor to create the site. And the framework, broadly speaking, is like an established approach with that language that you can use so that you don't have to rebuild everything every time. It's kind of like a template. in some way, a framework, in the sense that it's just a more efficient way to work. So when you are dealing with a developer, you should say to them, okay, what's the language that you're building with, and what's the framework that you want to use? And the reason that's really important is that you want to be able to hire other developers. And if the language that this person is using is unusual, or the framework is their own framework, sometimes developers create their own frameworks, you will run into a similar problem that David did, which is someone will look at it and go, wow, it will be harder for me to change this than to just start again. So you want to work with developers who are using technologies that are well understood across the software development industry, and where it's easy for you to be able to hire somebody to help them or replace them. If they're using very obscure stuff, it's going to be harder to find a replacement, and usually more expensive, by the way. So that's a thing that's worthwhile keeping in mind when you're selecting the coder. What language and framework are they using? Now, the last thing I'll say on this point is ask your software developer about the testing, the software testing that they want to use for your project. Software testing is really important to ensure code quality, and it's basically a way to double check and cross-reference code functionally so that you make sure that it works in all of the expected ways. I'm running out of time a little bit, and I'd love to leave some time for questions, so I don't want to go too much into the detail, but it's worth asking.
Patrick, some points.
Yeah.
We can't see your full slide. Can you get rid of the bar on the right-hand side?
Oh, is this the Zoom bar?
No, it is.
Or the chat bar?
No, it is.
Yes, no, I'm with you. Sorry, guys. Thank you for letting me know.
You're showing the presenter view.
Yes, I am. Yeah, by design, but so. All right. So hopefully you guys can see all the text now.
Much better. And we do much better, Pat, thanks.
Yep.
And we do have some questions in the chat from Michael and comments. If you would like to address those, watch out.
Just have a quick squiz. So now we're talking, so Michael Dousman, watch out for niche cutting edge frameworks. Yeah, that's a damn good point. So developers love to use the latest and greatest thing, but sometimes if you use like a sort of a new thing, that's a thing that actually doesn't gain widespread adoption, that other people will not know how to use. So it's a really good point from Michael.
It's a classic error, isn't it? And you can get really stuck. You can get really stuck, and we've got really stuck a number of times before. With really niche sort of languages and frameworks that we can't get rid of, and it's hard to hire for. So it's a good one.
It is hard to hire, and it's more expensive to hire. I mean, I tried to talk the client out of having a developer use Erlang for them, not because Erlang isn't great. It's just obscure, you know, like it's just harder to hire people for it. Anyway, so that's a great point, mate. Thank you for contributing it. In terms of other tech considerations, I kind of want to move on now. So software testing is important. Make sure your developer is doing it. Some developers don't, and it's a good indicator that they're not a good developer. So do ask the question about software testing, and do some research on software testing so that you actually understand the different types and which ones might be suitable for the project they're building. It will ultimately save you a lot of time and money if you have software testing built into the project. It should be part of the cost. So now we get to like the contract, or the, I suppose, the things that you want to make sure are part of the deal with your developer. So our big thing actually at Query, and it annoys me that other law firms don't operate like this more, is that you should avoid legal documents as long as possible. Legal documents are there to essentially execute a transaction, to translate commercial intention, but they are terrible for people communicating with each other, because essentially it means that then lawyers have to do the communicating because they're the only ones who understand the thing. It's much easier to negotiate a one-page summary of a deal than it is 40 pages of legalese. So just avoid legal documents until you guys are ready to sign. Now, you really have to work hard to create a work scope or a specification based on hopefully the designs you have brought to the developer if you followed the first slide. The developers want to know what they're doing. They're happy if they know what they're doing. If you bring them a design, they're going to be able to give you a much more informed opinion about what's the best way to execute this outcome that you're looking for on a screen. What do we need to do on the back end to give you this thing later on? Now, my view on the best way to do the deal is with a system called milestones. Milestones basically are a way to break the project into smaller pieces, and then you pay them once each of the pieces is complete, okay? And what that does is it means you don't end up having a huge project where stuff might go wrong, and you are having to pay a large amount of money up front, or the developer has a lot of risk in money that is unpaid. But if you just pay them amounts as you go, once parts of the project are complete, that is a way for everyone to work in a less risky way and to reduce the chances of arguments. Because if people are more relaxed, you're less likely to have an argument, basically. So I'm a big fan of milestones so far as software development projects are concerned. And the amount of money that you're paying for each milestone should be basically based on the percentage of the project that that milestone represents. If the first milestone is 20% of the project code, you want to pay them 20% of the money. In terms of coders, it's important to secure your intellectual property. Quite often coders reuse stuff from other projects, and that's actually good for everybody. The coder doesn't want to have to rebuild stuff for you every time. You know, it's more expensive for you and it's boring for them. So actually just make sure that the intellectual property that the coder brings to you, you don't have to own it. Sometimes people get fixated on actually owning code or owning everything in the project. That's not necessary. Just get a really wide license that lets you do what you like with the code that they've brought to your project that they want to maintain ownership of so they can use it for other clients. So don't be, I suppose the big lesson is, don't be fixated on owning all the code. Just be fixated on having the rights to use it for everything you need. Now, to finish off here, there's a phenomenon sometimes where coders, if they're in a dispute, will essentially switch off the server, or they won't give you the code to take it somewhere else if there's an argument. And basically, it's kind of a ransom technique. You don't get the code until you pay us what we think you owe us. And I have seen this many times. And basically, if you're a non-technical person, you don't have your own code, you're totally buggered at that point. There's really no way around it. You can take them to court, but usually the amounts of money are not worthwhile, and who the hell has time for that anyway? So what you want to do is try and create a situation where you can't be held to ransom. And the way that you do that is you need to maintain control of the URL, because that means that even if the coder switches off the servers, you can just redirect your URL to other servers with a new coder that you're using. So the URL control is crucial. And services like DNS Simple allow you to actually maintain control of the URL and then give your developer rights to make changes to it, because sometimes you're going to need to mess with the DNS settings, and that's complicated. You need a technical person to do that. The other thing is control the code, even if you don't understand a line of the code. Most coders are going to be using a version control system in the cloud like GitHub or GitLab. And even as a non-technical person, it's really easy for you to just go on that service and hit a download button and just get all the code. And you should do that every time the coder updates on a milestone, or sort of weekly, so that essentially you have a code base that you can give to another developer in the event that there's any kind of problem. So basically, I would say control the URL. If you keep a copy of the code, even when you don't understand it, that will save you from being held to ransom if there's a dispute. So that's the end of my presentation, everybody. I really am interested in helping people get into good arrangements together to not end up in disputes because they're terrible. I'm just fixing this so that you can read it. We specialize in this kind of thing. We're all tech literate at my firm. Well, at least most of us are tech literate at my firm. And so if any of you got any questions about this, or you're looking to do a deal and you want to make sure that everything's aligned to reduce the chance of problems, happy to talk to you. These are my contact deets. Feel free. So David, I don't want to sort of go over time, 2 minutes over time. So how do you want to run it from here, mate? I'm happy to hang and answer questions, but it's up to you.
You're completely good for time. You could have kept going. All good. We have another 27 minutes until the event is over, so plenty of time.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Right. I had it in my head that I was supposed to speak for about 20 minutes. So yeah, that's the length of presentation. So that's great, though. It leaves us a lot of time for questions.
It does, and we have plenty of them in the chat. So let's jump a little bit back here. Nikki is asking, what's about consumer protection hiring on Australia versus overseas?
Yes. So that's a really good point. The thing with hiring from overseas is it's always much less expensive. But if you can afford to hire within Australia, if there's a problem, you can use the law much more easily than if you're trying to sue someone in Ukraine, for instance. You know, it's really just not practical most of the time to try and take legal action against someone in a different country. So if you can work with Australian developers, yes, I'd recommend it. I suppose the point of some of the techniques that I was talking about today is to try and create a situation where you avoid legal. I mean, take it from a lawyer. You want to avoid legal disputes in any way possible. And if you can just do a few small deal tweaks at the start that reduce the chances of misunderstandings or problems, it's worth doing them. Because the misunderstandings code is hard, building products is hard. It's part of the reason we all love it, actually. It's challenging, perhaps. David sometimes notices the difference between the word hard and challenging. So, I mean, it's challenging. And when people are under pressure, sometimes they end up in disputes, even though neither of them came into the deal with bad intention. It's just that it's really easy to have misunderstandings, especially when one person is more experienced than the other. You're talking about a complicated thing, asymmetries of knowledge between coder and client. So do your best to put in place the things that avoid disputes. That's what this is all about.
And which is probably having a good communication channel and a good way to communicate with each other in the first place. There's a lot of legal issues.
Absolutely.
A lot of arguments raised because the communication is just not working well.
Honestly, most of them are. So, and I've said this to you before, David, I actually, even having worked as a lawyer for 15 years, people want to get wealthy together. You know, they want to collaborate and do fun stuff. They usually are not going into a deal wanting to cause the other person trouble. What ends up causing disputes is when something goes wrong that no one expected. There's a misunderstanding. And when there's a misunderstanding, once it actually happens, everyone has 10 reasons why they should not pay the cost for that misunderstanding. But the more you talk about these things before, the more clear the communication is, the less chance you end up having the misunderstanding, which then invariably ends up in a dispute of some sort. It's just better for everyone if you take the time up front. And I'm sure that software devs here would agree with this. Take the time up front. Even pay the software developer to help you spec it. That's a better option too. You know, like if you've got a software dev who's happy to work with you to specify what you want, and you're okay to pay them to do that, that's actually a really good idea too. So yeah, I don't want to talk too long. Let's get through a few more questions. Do you want to just grab them, David?
Yeah, probably follow up with that, and be aware what are the skills and what you're paying for. You're paying a software developer for working code that applies to a framework in a certain language. You're not paying it for user testing. That is another person.
That's a good point. Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of like paying a lawyer when a paralegal can do it. You know, you want to not be paying the coder to do everything that sometimes cheaper people can do. And you know, coders are paid more than quality assurance testers, just as a basic example. Quite often, rather than having manual testing to the extent that you want to do it done by a software developer, have it done by someone who's a professional QA.
And not just that, we get the right tool for the right job, right? You mentioned the designers, yes, designers, and the
person with the relevant skill set. Yeah, absolutely.
And UX people, you can do a lot of testing if your product is going to work with the clients long before you start getting code into your computer.
That is true, and that, I mean, I'm not going to talk about minimum viable product and all that sort of startup gospel. But yeah, build as little as possible, because obviously when you get the thing in the world, it works in unanticipated ways and you need to make lots of changes. So you want to make the surface area as small as possible. And it's really easy to go down the route of building too big based on a few assumptions that turn out to be incorrect once they encounter real people. I mean, I should reiterate, I've made many of these mistakes myself. As a software developer, it's actually hard to do the job well or challenging. So do you want to get to another question, David? And by the way, like, please, everyone, feel free to just add them to the chat. That looks like the approach we're taking here.
Talking about frameworks, do you choose frameworks based on security, privacy requirements for your product, or is that something that you consider when you choose a framework for your coding?
It can be. I don't think it is usually, though, in the sense that every framework, or at least the good ones, need to have good security. And they're almost all open source code. So to the extent that there are security problems, people are looking at the code publicly and often identify them. You may have some frameworks that are better at security than others. Some frameworks make it easier to make mistakes with security, actually. But that's a thing that you want to get advice from the coder for. And just be careful that you check what you're told, because sometimes if a coder is accustomed to using a framework or a particular language, that may not be the best tool for the job that you have in mind. And so it's actually a good idea to double check with other people, perhaps other coders who you know, to check, look, this guy's suggesting that I use Node.js with React on the front end. Does that sound like it makes sense to you? And you can get a read from other people. I mean, it's all about just getting cross-referencing and second opinions as you go. You should just not believe everything that someone says because they happen to know more than you. The old adage is, be careful when you ask a barber if you need a haircut. The same thing with coders, you know. And the other one, by the way, on the other side of that idea is when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so I think sometimes coders are like, code will solve this, you know, and yeah, maybe it will, but maybe it's more expensive than if you used a designer, for instance.
Yes. And if something just, it is easy to be overwhelmed when people are using fancy language that you do not understand. But the people that really want to work with you and have your best interest in mind, they try to communicate in a language that resonates with you.
Totally. I mean, it is a really challenging thing to talk to clients or talk to people about technical matters if you're technical and they're not. It's exhausting. So, you know, this is, it's a common problem. You know, I have the same problem, not just with code, but with law, obviously, because law needs interpretation a lot of the time. I actually saw, so a really good point here by Lorenzo. And he was saying that there are many ways of developing code. So these approaches automatically solve some of the issues you've raised. What is your opinion on that? My opinion on that is absolutely, you're right. There are all sorts of new approaches like microservices that are meeting common problems with building a project. The golden rule, though, is when someone suggests something, it's a good idea to check it with someone else who knows that thing, especially if you've got like a scope worth $100,000 and you're going to be committed to that scope over time. It's really worth double, triple checking these things. And like I said, you can always go and find another coder on a service like Upwork or people who you know who understand enough to tell you if what someone is telling you is more in their self-interest than in yours. So other things, so good reference for technology stacks from Michael. That's a really interesting thing. I've not seen this before. Oh, okay. Yeah, tech stacks for famous products. That's cool. That's helpful.
Yeah, so take it with a grain of salt. I think there's a lot of info in there, but if someone suggests I want to use X, Y, or Z, if you find it here and you find that like Uber are using it, it gives you some comfort. I guess that's all I would say.
Absolutely, mate. No, that's a great point. And I didn't want to get too much into detail, but maybe I have time. I mean, so Michael, I'm sure you've sort of come across like every coder before you use a package or a framework, you go and look at the GitHub repo to see how much activity and maintenance there is on that repo to make sure
the last thing changed. Yeah.
Totally. You want to see the last commit. You know, if the last commit was 2 days ago, sweet, we've got a very active project. If the last commit was 2 years ago, and that happens often because people get bored of open source stuff and they just leave it to lie fallow, then you want to think twice. Certainly is, mate. Every good coder
lots of open issues is another red flag, I think.
Yeah, mate, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's another red flag for me. In fact, I think there's someone who's built a website somewhere that analyzes that data and gives you a rating on a repo in terms of its currency. And guys, when I say repo, for the non-technical, I'm just talking about pieces of code that you can use for your application so you don't have to rebuild it. So I'm just, thanks, Michael, for adding that in.
I think in that direction, that's another question from Nikki. How do you protect yourself that your coder is not using the code that he developed for you for other projects? Is that an issue?
Yeah, so certainly you can specify that in the contract. And it's an issue that you have to deal with on a case-by-case basis. If what you're doing is really, really original, it's more fair for you to be worried about the reuse of that code, okay? But as an example, like if someone's building you just a blog, pretty unreasonable for you to say, well, I want you not to reuse the code for the blog for other people. And that comes down to the negotiation about the intellectual property, which when you're dealing with a serious project, it is worth talking to a lawyer about how to splice and dice the rights about the code if you have concerns about that. I don't want to get too much into the detail there because it gets boring quickly.
I think there's a lot of unjustified fear about IP, especially in early stages. There is not that much uniqueness in so many applications that we have seen.
Totally agree. Yes. So that's what I was saying before. Don't get obsessed with owning the code. Just get obsessed with having the right to use it. So I'm in complete agreement with you there. It's usually not that big an issue. And to be honest with you, there's rarely intellectual property disputes, especially about early stage stuff. You just want to have your ducks in a row. When it comes time to talk to investors, it's much less of a hassle to get it done at the time than it is when the investors say, well, do you even own what you want us to invest in? And you have to then like rush around and try and figure it out. Like it's good to have your ducks in a row when you're talking to investors so that you can prove to them, well, we have a signed contract and we own the intellectual property. So, you know, for that reason, actually, mainly, it's practically speaking, very useful. Do we have other, repo rating thing, Git star ranking. Oh, interesting. Thanks, Michael. That's that I'm quite sure is the thing that I had in mind.
So when we jump back to the Git star and GitHub world, as a non-technical person, what do you really look at there? So I hear people talking about the Git, check the coders GitHub, but for me as a non-coding person, and I'm a technical person, I'm an engineer, but not a software engineer. Even for me, it is a rabbit hole that I do not have the map for.
Right. Yes. So look, Git stars are actually not necessarily the best thing, because quite often, as someone mentioned earlier, sort of cutting edge or new approaches that don't end up being that consequential get a lot of stars because they've been at the top of Hacker News or something. Actually, what Michael was saying earlier is absolutely correct. When was the last commit? Right. So actually, you know what? I might even, because we've got a little bit of time. So something like Node.js, I just show people what GitHub looks like on this. So Puppeteer, that's the first thing that pops up. Let me share a screen.
Right.
And just show you guys what this looks like. So are you guys seeing Puppeteer repo, David?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's what we're saying. That's what you're sharing.
Okay, great. So guys, you'll see here in the right-hand side, you've got like, this is an active repo. This is something that is well maintained, and you can tell because like there were commits as long ago as like 14 hours. That's really like a good indicator that this is under active development. The other thing you want to do is look at contributors. The more contributors there are, the better the code package will be for keeping up to date with security problems and patches that are required. And used by, that's going to give you some indicator of how many projects are using it, and therefore what the motivation is to continue to contribute to it. And then issues here. Now, Michael was talking before about lots of issues being a red flag. I would say in this case, yeah, actually this is a lot of issues, but I wouldn't discount this based on the number of issues because it's such a large repo and it's used by so many people. Although actually, honestly, these issues don't make it look very good. Michael, do you have an opinion on that? What would you say about 1.9?
How many of those are closed?
Well, I believe that's how many are open, right? Like
there's a huge volume. There's a huge volume of closed issues, right? So I just think it's a very active repo, so it looks all right to me.
Yeah, well, there's 1,800 issues open. Actually, honestly, that's not great.
That's not super great, no.
No, in my opinion. If I was looking at this, I'd go, these guys need to tighten up this project.
And I guess in the context of the sort of audience here, it's like if your developer's recommending, for example, that it's critical that we use Puppeteer, and you come and check this, be like, well, what about all of the open issues? Yeah, it's just something you can ask.
It would be worth mentioning and asking about, yeah. But I mean, look, honestly, you're not going to have too much trouble here because it's used by so many people and there's so many contributors. Those are really good indicators.
Yeah, it's true.
So look, I'll stop sharing. So Peter has mentioned here, by the way, about intellectual property, that background IP is how you refer to the code that a developer brings to the project often. And that's exactly right. You don't have to call it background IP, but often people refer to the stuff that the coder brings to the project and wants to maintain ownership of background IP, just so you all know. I don't want to be the only person who talks here. And I actually even welcome disagreement. If anyone disagrees with me on something or feels like there's something that I've missed that they should add, I'm more than happy to hear it.
Oh, I've got some comments.
Please, go ahead.
So I am a software developer, and I could give a talk on your talk, but I won't. I will say this though: if a product is particularly that is the startup, the business itself is particularly dependent on the tech, you might want to consider getting someone technical as part of the team.
Definitely. Totally.
And the reason for that is that, I mean, I work for companies that have very fixed requirements. The project starts, you execute, they're done. But startups are quite different. It's almost like you build version 1 and immediately you realize you need version 2, then you need version 3, and everything's evolving quickly. And unless you have someone whose heart and soul is in it, I'm not sure you're going to get the best outcome. That's just something I've noticed over many years.
Petrus, that I could not agree more. And I had an investor get me to review 3 pitch decks from a legal perspective recently, and all 3 of them did not have technical people as founder members of the team. They had all hired technical people later. And that's a red flag for investors, because software developers are in high demand and they switch jobs quickly.
That's right.
So ideally, you want to have a software developer as a founding member. So I really appreciate you adding that. I mean, I'm often working with people who don't have that luxury, which is why I've sort of focused the presentation on that. But if you can get a software dev on your team, 100%, clearly better.
The other thing I'll say about designers. So there are several types of designers. There's like this general graphic designer. In fact, I'm in a company right now, they're all sitting out there in front of me. Then there's some print designers. They're graphic designers that specialize in print, and they say they might do some web. Just stay clear of those because they're print specialists. Then there's
good point. Yeah.
There's digital designers, which is possibly what you want. And again, there's one sitting 20 meters from you right now. And then there's UX, UI designers. But really you want a digital UX designer who's focused on data. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean by that. So you were talking about wireframes, which are layouts of each screen in your system. Now, the death is in the detail of a wireframe. And I'll give you an example that everyone here should identify with. Imagine you put a username, password, login button, like every system you've ever seen has, right? If you just drew that, it wouldn't be complete. You have to cover every possible error state in that system. So for instance, you type a username and a password, submit, there's no username or password. What do you see next? Do you see this error message? There are no users with this username. Do you see this message? You've entered the password incorrectly. Which of the two do you see? Do you have auto suggest? You start typing in a username and there's some sort of, after a few characters, it tells you it's incorrect. Like the options just go on, and non-technical people don't see these things, but each of those is a unit of work. So if you give a software developer a username and a password screen and they just do something and it works, but you want all this stuff at it, that's additional work. And you might have this argument that, well, you should have known that. You know, I expect it's best practice that. And the software developer will say, you didn't tell me that.
Yeah.
And I'd suggest if you're not technical, you're really not going to be able to see every rule in a wireframe. You're going to need that very data heavy digital UX designer, or probably a dev who's good at this type of specifying to really lock down a spec. And that's, again, you know, that's probably why you want this person in your system, because you just get a better result.
You've spoken like a man who's worked in this area clearly for a long time. You're exactly right to draw attention to all of that. There are designers and there are designers, absolutely. More detail, the better, absolutely. And that's, I think, the thing. The more work you do up front, usually proportionally, you reduce your risk.
Yeah,
someone's got their hand up. But please, I don't want to interrupt, Petrus.
I've got one saying on this. I've never been involved in a project ever where I said, we spent too much time specifying this. Never. It's always, why didn't we spend more? Because specking is about 10 to 20, maybe even 100 times faster than writing code.
Yes, absolutely.
So what you miss will magnify in problems down the track.
That may be the quote of the presentation. I've never spent too much time specifying. Absolutely. I'm all for it. Nikki's put her hand up. David, do you want to, do we switch to Nikki, or does Nikki just speak? How do we work it?
Nikki, do you want to? Yes,
Hi.
to speak.
Yeah, and I'm here.
So good to hear you.
Good to see you again. Just wanted to ask a quick question with respect to anyone who is actually going out and has an idea. They, do their research, develop all that sort of stuff, and they see that it's a viable idea. And then they go into the phase of actually appointing possibly a team of developers or whatever, international or within Australia. A lot of the time, though, those people who are creating an idea don't have that technical background, as you mentioned at the very beginning. Now, just like Petra said before, and I totally agree that, when you're setting out an idea and everything, making sure that you've got a technical person on your side is, invaluable. Like you just really should have someone there, such as we did. We took on an architect who basically partnered with us. They're not a founding member, but they're partnering with us. And before they came on, and I was doing research at the very beginning, this is all a couple of years ago, the main point was when I was researching, I was chatting to developers and I was chatting to the designers, all the teams, and basically saying, look, I've come up with some major designs through a UX company, UX UI design company. We did it together, but we can't have every single page designed, obviously, because that is a designer plus coder situation where they've got to work together to see a flow, a process and all that sort of stuff. Because when you're building software, obviously, and I'm not a developer, but when you're building software, it's obviously got to make sure it reads across, like it follows a flow, and both sides have to see it. It's like you've got a builder and an architect building a house, that sort of thing, or an engineer involved somewhere along the way. So my question is, if you're someone who doesn't have that technical background, can't afford having a member that could be a technical person on your team, well, where does the fine line, break anywhere where you can actually ask the developer, I need your assistance in, here's our login page design, but I need your assistance and your expertise because you're the one who understands the flow and process. Where does that go? Like what happens for people? Because that sort of almost came across as though if you don't know it, tough luck. We're just not going to design those pages for you.
Yeah, I think if you can work with the developer to further specify and even pay them for the work of helping you specify all the detail, that's actually a thing you should do. And that's assuming that you can afford to do that. So I think Petrus really quoted the presentation. We never thought that we didn't specify enough. The more you do, the better.
I actually have a principle in my own business. Actually, this is not for startups, but it's just general client work. Someone just throws me something and says, give me a cost. I don't even work on those projects anymore. I have to be involved in this thing.
Yeah,
because
that's
it's just,
great.
From my perspective, it's tire kicking.
Yeah.
And that's what most of my colleagues
also a really
agree.
good point. Yeah, I mean, if people are serious, they tend to come to you knowing what they want. And I suppose part of the reason, sometimes people don't know what it is that you need to quote them. And I suppose part of the presentation here is to try and tell people you actually really need to bring this thing into existence as much as you can before you get to a developer. That's kind of the message. And you'd be surprised how often people don't. And they do. They just throw an idea at a dev. And sometimes developers will just go for it because they want to get the client in the door. And, it's a recipe for disaster. I've seen a few of those disasters, and I like to help people get aligned to avoid those disasters.
Pay for the creation of the specifications. If you
definitely, if you can. Yeah.
If it's the developer who is happy to give you a hand with that, pay for that part of the job. If it's a external person, a separate person, pay for that separately. Get those requirements right. The more precise they are, the more likely you get what you want.
Totally agree with that.
There's a good joke on this. It was on the Big Bang Theory. Someone came to Sheldon and said, hey, Sheldon, I've got this fantastic idea. Teleportation. It'll make me a fortune. And Sheldon says, well, how are you going to do that? He says, I don't know. You're the engineer.
Fair point. There is that attitude sometimes that just make it happen. Just don't bother me with the detail and make it happen. And I have run into people with that mentality, and it's not one that usually ends well. Help your developer. That would be the other way to put it.
Help each other.
Yeah, totally. What other, so no code MVP is always the best start. That's a comment from Nikki. I mean, that works sometimes. Yeah, if you can get away with that, great. The less development up front while you're validating the idea, the better. But that's sort of straying into business strategy, and that's not really what I'm here to talk about. But I agree with the sentiment.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I'm a big fan of no code to get started and validate ideas in between wireframes and coding if feasible. Some stuff can't be done with no code, but that's a topic for another chat. We're basically at the end of the session. Any more questions? Please feel free to stay here and have a chat. Patrick, do you have a little bit more time if people want to stay?
Yeah, mate. No, I've got more time. I'm just actually double checking. So there's David Tom Klasky has put his profile on LinkedIn in the comments. And David is a solutions architect. Do you want to jump on and say something, David, at all? He might not be hearing me.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there you are, fella. Okay, please, let everybody know what it is that you're up to as a solutions architect.
Oh, hey. So my name is David here. I'm working for a small company on the Gold Coast. I mainly do like independent contracts. I specialize in serverless architectures. Yeah, that's me. Yeah, my main stack is Node.js. I work with many developers overseas, so whatever you say, guys, it's quite helpful. Yeah, that's
what would you say the difference is between a solutions architect and a developer?
Well, so yeah, with solution architecture, I spend a lot of time designing like building the cloud and finding best way to use different infrastructure across different cloud providers. That's how I understand this. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Look, I really appreciate you throwing your hat into the ring, mate. Does anyone else have any other questions? Like, happy to sort of throw the ball around a bit.
And if you just want to tell the people a little bit what you're doing as well. Patrick, how can people reach you? I'm just about to post your LinkedIn profile link.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I've put the query link
I'll
up
just do a share screen. Here it is here. So our website's querylaw.com, and you can email me on pat.brown@querylaw.com. And, this is an area that we work in a lot. And as I said before, you actually want to do as much of the specification as you can before you end up in contract land. Quite often I have people come to me and they say, I want a software development contract. And I'm like, well, have you guys agreed actually what you're going to do commercially? And they're like, no. So I send them back to the developer to figure that out first. So that's there for anyone who's interested.
Good. And there is, thanks for that, Patrick. Good advice. There are Patrick details. I've also put it up there in the chat, so please connect with him and reach out to Patrick if you have any questions. Josh is putting in the chat that he is looking for a designer to help him with a time management app. So if you're a designer, please reach out to Josh. Cool. I think we're done. It was a great session. We had up to close to 40 people, peak times. Numbers are dropping a little bit. I think it's about time to say goodbye.
Yeah, cool with that. And thank you again, Petrus, for the contributions, mate. Really lovely to hear from a software developer at the end of that.
No worries.
Petrus, where are you based?
Melbourne.
Melbourne. Cool. We will send a link, a follow-up email with the link to the recording to anyone if anyone wants to follow up with that. And yeah, please feel free to connect with us. And looking forward to see many of you on future events, online or live.
Thanks for putting it on, David. Appreciate the chance to tell everybody stuff.
thank you for the great session. Great number of people, great content, great contribution from everyone. Thank you all so much. Have fun.
All right.